Hejsa. I've been using these little fabric baskets or fabric pots for a little while. So you can see I use it for my hexagons, and once I fill up a pot I transfer them into a big box that I have for them. So this is almost full now. I also really like using them for tiny little scraps. I know I could use a bowl or a basket or something, but what I really like about this is that because it's in a fabric container, everything sort of sticks together, so even if I drop it, most of it just sort of stays together unless I really try and shake it out. So I think it's really great for that sort of thing. So I thought I would show you how to make one of these. It's really easy. These ones I made using this template that I cut out from a piece of A3 card or heavy paper or whatever it was. But as you can probably imagine, it creates a lot of waste when you're cutting it. So although this makes it easy because you have to do less seams, I've started making them a little bit differently. And I've cut the pieces that I'm going to use, and I've prepared some of them already. So the two I showed you, they are quilted, so there's the fabric, wadding, and some fabric to line it. The very first one I made is this one, and this is not quilted, so that's very soft. It does stand up, but if you put something heavy in it, then it sort of falls over, so I prefer the quilted one. You can also use some kind of stabilizer or interfacing if you prefer that. So here I've cut the 3 pieces that are quilted. Don't know if you can see the quilting. And I just did some wobbly lines across it. When you're preparing these, make sure that you cut your fabric and the wadding so that it is larger than what you will actually need, because when you quilt it, it does tend to just shrink slightly. But I suppose for this it doesn't really matter too much. You can always make the pot slightly smaller if you want. So I quilted my fabric, and then I've cut out 3 pieces for the outside. I suppose you could put the quilted side on the inside if you want, but I like it that it has a little bit of pattern. I'll put the measurements for this particular size of pot in the description, but of course you can make it any size you want, as long as what will be the bottom is the same size as the sides of the pot. And you could even make it a rectangular pot if you wanted to. So these are my outside pieces, and then I have the lining pieces, and I just used a random scrap. I think this is actually a good thing to use random scraps for, both the inside and the outside. And for the quilted bit you could even use an orphan block maybe. So let's start putting it together. So the long piece here is about 3 times the size of the short piece, if I have cut it correctly. So I'm just going to fold it in half and just crease it, and then I can make a little mark. And then I take my 2 side pieces and do the same, or I suppose I only need to do it in one end. Give that a little mark as well. Right, so now I have marked my 2 side pieces and the other piece. And I don't know if you can see the little mark on there. So I'm going to line those 2 marks up. And I'm going to pin that on there. I think we only need 2 pins on that. And then flip it over and do the same on the other side. This is pinned together and ready to be sewn together. But first I'm going to prepare the lining in the same way. And yes, I have not ironed this fabric. I just couldn't be bothered. But it's fine. It will straighten itself out once it's in use. Obviously, if I was making this as a gift for someone, then I would iron it to make it look nicer. Right, so this is now pinned together as well. So next I'm going to take it, both of them, to the sewing machine and sew them together along this bit here and here, and do the same for the outside piece. And I'll be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for it. So I'll take this to the sewing machine now, and then I'll come back and show you the next step. Right, so I've sewn my pieces together now. One thing I forgot to mention before I did that is you have to start sewing 1/4 inch from the edge of the piece and stop 1/4 inch from the other edge, because otherwise the next step is going to be a bit awkward. Because what we do next is to sort of fold this in half, or not half, on the diagonal. So this is the small piece, and then we lay one end of the long piece over that. so that you'll be able to sew up that corner of the box. But if we don't leave this gap, 1/4 inch gap, or whatever your seam allowance is, then it's going to be very tricky to do that. And then I put in some needles so that it stays in place. So then when I go to the sewing machine, so you can see here's my folded corner. And this corner here is a little bit tricky to get to stay in place, so I think I'll just put another pin in it. But I put the pin in at a diagonal so that it's not right where I want to start sewing, because ideally I would start sewing right there in the corner and then sew up this line here. So I'm just going to go do that now, and then you can see what it looks like. So now I've sewn the 2 pieces together. It went a little bit fast here in the corner, so it went over, but it doesn't really matter. So now that is sewn together, and you can see it's starting to look a bit like a box. So now I want to turn it around. And now these 2 edges are going to come together. So this is the edge that we just sewn together, and now we're going to sew up this side here. So I'm taking the other end of the long piece and folding it around to line up with the short piece. And you want to make sure that where the fabric comes up, that it doesn't sort of fold that way. You want it to be out of the way so that you're not sewing into it. I like to put a pin in it so that it stays out of the way, like that. And then I put a couple pins in here. And then that is ready to be sewn together. And I think I might as well just pin this together as well on the other side. So this is the other short piece, and this is the long end. And make sure the fabric is out of the way so I don't sew into it. It's not a big deal if I do, but I would rather be sewing than unpicking. For some reason this side is a little bit shorter. I don't know if maybe I folded it a little bit wrong or what happened, but it's no big deal. Once I've sewn it together, I can just trim that little extra off. So now this is almost a box, just gotta be sewn together. So I'm just gonna put the outside together as well so I can sew everything at the same time. So just fold that down, just makes it a bit easier, at least to start with. Fold that over. Where the outside is quite thick because of the wadding, may want to just snip off a little bit of the corner, and if you can, just snip off the wadding, because then there's still the fabric that you can sew through. So I think I'll just do that all the corners before I do anything else. It just helps to avoid those corners being so thick to sew through. Alright, let's do this again. So fold it on the diagonal and then fold over the long piece. It's a little bit more awkward because it's thicker. I think I'm going to use my clips for this. And again, make sure that you fold the long piece out of the way so that you don't accidentally sew into it. Oh, this end is also longer. I wonder what's happened there. But I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to sew it together and then trim it. Alright, so I have my 2 pieces ready. Just gotta sew up all these corner seams, and then I'll be ready for the next step. So I'll take them to the sewing machine and then I'll come back. My 2 pieces are done now, and you can see they're starting to look like little boxes or fabric pots or whatever you want to call them. So I just want to have a look, because especially on this one there's quite a big difference, and I'm not entirely sure why, but I think I'm just going to carefully trim that. And this one was slightly larger as well. Oh, that went a bit wonky. That would do, won't it? And right now I've just realized that I forgot to do something, or rather I did something that I shouldn't have, because I was supposed to leave a turning gap on one of these sides here, but obviously I haven't. So there's going to be a short break while I find my seam ripper and sort that out. Alright, so this is ready now to be used. So I backstitched a couple of times here where I wanted to make this turning gap, and then I ripped the seam so that now it's open. Right, the next thing we're going to do is turn the, just cut this off. Is turn the outside right sides out. And push out the corners. here it also helps if you're able to cut off some of the wadding in the corner. It just reduces the bulk in the corner. There we go. So now we have the outside with the right side facing out, and then we have the inside or the lining with the wrong side facing out. Now we put the outer box in the inside one. Can be a bit awkward sometimes. And then you want to line up the corners. Just start by lining up one of them. Just put a pin in it on one of the clips so that it's held in place while you do the rest of them. And you want to flatten out the corners so that they sit nicely together. Okay, I'm not entirely sure what's happened here. The inside, rather the outside of the box is somehow larger than the inside. This is sort of the opposite situation to a TARDIS, I guess. But I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to clip that together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the lining as the guideline for my sewing. I'm just going to ignore that that's there. Once I've sewn it together, I'm going to trim it off. So maybe my box is a little bit lopsided, but who cares? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all the way around the top here, again using a quarter inch seam allowance. And you can choose whether you want to nest the seams or if you want to open them up flat. It doesn't really matter. I tend to sort of let the fabric decide how it wants to be sewn together. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and then I'll be back and show you what that looks like. Now my two pieces are sewn together. But before I show you what I'm doing next, I just thought I would show you. So when I'm sewing it together, the sewing machine, I sort of fold it down, holding the edges that I'm not sewing out of the way, and then as it moves along I adjust it so that I can sew it, because it's a little bit awkward. It's an awkward shape and an awkward size. Alright, so now I want to trim this off. I guess I could have used my rotary cutter, but I think I have more control over it using the scissors. Yeah, that's okay. I'm not sure if it's even or not even, but it doesn't really matter. So now I've got to find my turning gap. This is a little bit awkward because it's a small hole and we have some wadding and fabric here, so just do it gently so that you don't accidentally split the seam. A turning gap that's about 2 to 2.5 inches. That should be fine. Alright. So first I'm just gonna one more time press out the corners of my outside. And then the lining is ready. And the next step is to sew together the turning gap. Along both sides of the turning gap, you want to fold down the fabric about 1/4 of an inch. And then put them together. The fabric should sort of fold naturally there anyway. And then just clip it together, or use pins if you want. So I like to clip it or pin it just where it starts and then in the middle, just so I know everything stays in place. So now I'm going to sew this together with probably 1/8 of an inch, just to make sure that I'm within that 1/4 inch. So I'm going to do that now. The turning gap is sewn together now, and I've overlapped slightly where it started and ended, just to make sure that everything is nice and secure. So now I can fold the lining inside. And then I'm going to press down the corners so that they sit nicely in the corners on the outside box. Sometimes you have to fiddle with it a little bit just to get it right. So now I'm going to go all the way around that top edge and sort of pull the fabrics apart so that I can flatten it down and get right to the seam almost, because the last step is to sew all the way around the top edge, and you don't want weird sort of bulges of fabric sitting around the edge. Maybe I'm using more clips than I need, but I like everything to be staying in place before I start sewing. Here I actually folded that fabric on the, I don't think it's in the danger zone, but just want to make sure that it isn't, and pull it right down so that I don't accidentally sew the lining onto the outside in a weird spot. Right, so now this is ready for the last step, which is to sew all the way around the top, again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. For this step, because there's quite a few layers now. You might want to use a slightly longer stitch length. It's up to you. You could also do a couple of lines of stitching to add a little bit of decoration, or use a fancy stitch on your sewing machine if you have a sewing machine with fancy stitches. I'm just going to use plain stitches, so I'm going to do that now. Here is my finished little pot or box or whatever you want to call it. I'm quite happy with that. I really like this fabric. I've had it for ages and I didn't know what to use it for. I think I might make another one in this fabric. It's very cheerful. So as you can probably tell, the box won't stay square. It sort of tends to round itself. I don't mind that. But if it bothers you, you may want to pinch the corners slightly and just make a little sort of 1-inch seam. So this is about half an inch here, and then half an inch at the top, and then go down about an inch, and that should keep it in place. But for a box this small, I don't really think it's an improvement. It will sort of decrease the opening size. But if you made a bigger one, then I think maybe, yeah, then I would pinch the corners just to give it a bit more stability, because if it was larger, then it might just sort of flop all over the place. So yeah, I'm chuffed with my little basket, box, pot, whatever you want to call it. I suppose you could add a loop to it if you wanted to. So I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial, and if you make any of these pots, do let me know. Maybe tag me on Instagram. I hope you have a great day and happy stitching.